Greetings. My name is Jalondra Davis, otherwise known as Mami Melusine. I am a writer, scholar, educator, dancer, mermaid enthusiast, and all-around creative. Welcome to the Merwomanist podcast, where we talk about Black mermaid lore, fantasy, spirituality, and aquatic culture. Dive in and enjoy. Hello, and welcome back to the Merwomanist podcast with Mami Melusine. And today's episode is going to be a brief kind of wrap up of some of my favorite Black middle grade fantasy. So my last episode was talking about the Legendborn cycle and some of my thoughts on Black YA fantasies. And actually not just Black YA fantasies, but a little bit of fantasy more broadly, which has been a little bit hit or miss for me since I've been reading more fantasy and reading more youth literature. But I did say that I was going to talk about middle grade because I have actually enjoyed the middle grade books a lot. So within middle grade, all of these titles are by Black writers and they're all about Black girls. I haven't really read a lot of other middle grade fantasies. I've read other YA fantasies, but not really other middle grade fantasies kind of outside of my focus area, but I do hope to do so eventually. So I'm just going to be talking about some of these and what I think. This will include some mermaid texts, but they're not all mermaid texts. So my first is Bayou Magic by Jewell Parker Rhodes. I actually have a couple copies of this, so you could see the different covers if you're watching the video. Bayou Magic, I think, was published in 2016 by Jewell Parker Rhodes. Bayou Magic is part of the Louisiana Girls trilogy that I'll talk about next. And then there's another one that I haven't read that I'm going to get soon. So this is one of the mermaid books. It's about a little girl named Maddie, who Maddie has three sisters, and her grandmother lives on the Louisiana Bayou. And I think she refers to her grandmother as a grand-mère. So it has some of that element of like that Creole culture. And so her grandmother lives in a rural area in a community in the Bayou in the Gulf Coast. And every summer she sends for one of her granddaughters to come spend the summer with her. She just sends the name and that's it. And so this summer, Maddie goes to stay with her grandmother and she befriending people, learning about the Bayou, and she meets a mermaid who she learns is Mami Wata. And this mermaid traveled with her own ancestor across the Middle Passage to live amongst her descendants in the Bayou. And Maddie develops this special relationship with the mermaid, and the mermaid helps her to navigate a terrible ecological disaster that happens in the novel, which is based on an actual event that happened in the Gulf Coast, which I guess I will not say what it is because of spoilers. So yeah, this book is so beautiful. It's very beautifully written, and it's just a really great example of how you could write for a very accessible reading level and write for children, but it can also be beautiful. I think the writing is very beautiful, even though it's also very simple and clear. So I have read some writing intended for youth that I felt like was sort of writing down to the reader. And the writing was like simple in a way that wasn't beautiful, right? I think the writing in this book is really beautiful. I think the story is developed, it's plotted perfectly. I think that the way the climax and the magic and the way things happen in order to deal with this cataclysmic event is a little too quick and simple and clean, but also it's intended for very young readers. So it is what it is. I did feel like we had all this beautiful buildup, and then I feel like the actual scene, the actual climactic scene was just like a little too quick and easy, I thought, which that would be my only critique of it. It definitely is grounded in an African-derived spirituality, kind of nature religion, though it doesn't necessarily name it. I taught this book in a course that I called Black Girlhood and Magic because I was trying not to, use Black Girl Magic in a particular way. But of course, all the students just call it the Black Girl Magic class. But in that class, I was teaching science fiction, speculative fiction, and even books that just categorized as literature, but that were still grounded in magical systems that were grounded in African diasporic religions. So by the time students read this book, they had already learned a little bit about hoodoo and voodoo. So they definitely saw the elements of voodoo in the book, even though it doesn't name itself. So Mama, her grandmere is kind of the spiritual leader of this Bayou community and leads these kind of ritual kind of events, but they're not specific. There are no specific deities named. And so this is something that I see in a lot of the literature that I'm reading, particularly for young people, where it's certainly grounded in a magic system that feels derived from African derived magic systems, but it doesn't necessarily name them or name specific deities. And I think this could be a good way, I think, to portray these kinds of systems, but also have a little bit of freedom to kind of play with them where you're not distorting an actual religion. It's a choice. And I think for the most part, I do think it's a good one. Okay, the next one is Ninth Ward, also by Jewell Parker Rhodes, and this is part of the Louisiana Girls trilogy, which I would definitely categorize Bayou Magic as fantasy. Ninth Ward, it might be fantasy or just fiction, kind of depending on who's reading it. A book like this is very similar to books that I read growing up by Black women authors that didn't necessarily name themselves and weren't categorized or sold as fantasy or science fiction or speculative fiction, but they had elements, right? They had ghosts, right? Something like Beloved or something like Tina McRoansa's Baby of the Family, which is on my shelf somewhere, where there are these elements in them that people outside of Black culture would call speculative, but that I don't know that Black people always necessarily see as speculative, right? Just the acknowledgement in the existence of spirits, not to say that all Black people believe in spirits, but I do think from a Southern derived, growing up acculturated with lots of Black people, African American perspective, I do think those are things we kind of accept the reality of, right? I'm going to detour for a second, but I had an interesting experience lately. My younger sister, her dog, her beloved dog, who I called my nephew, right? Because she had this dog for so long, died last summer. And ever since the dog died, my son has been talking to a dog. He's been pretending that he's holding a dog. He's been like talking to something on the ground next to him and like picking it up and cradling him. And we'll go places. Sometimes he'll be holding this dog, or he'll, like, if he needs to go do something, he'll hand the dog to me and then go do whatever he's going to do. And so we were at one of his Down syndrome organization events. And we're not the only Black family, but we're one of very, very few Black families who's involved in this organization. And he was like picking up the dog. And I was like, oh, yeah, I think that might be my little sister's dog. I think the dog is still with us. And the people, and these are white people, the people I was talking to, their eyes just got big and they were like, well, children just play pretend. They just play pretend. And I was like, yeah, children pretend. And sometimes I think the dog's still with us. And they kept kind of pushing back. And I was just, I don't know, they just seemed super uncomfortable with the possibility that the dog is still with us, right? They just seemed super uncomfortable with that. And they were uncomfortable with it to the point where they couldn't allow for it just to be a possibility. We could have multiple possibilities. Yes, he can just be playing pretend and the dog could still be around. Like, both can be possible, and we can leave open room for multiple things to be true at once. And they were super uncomfortable. So that was just one of those things that reminded me that that is a certain kind of like cultural perspective or framework that can allow for that. Not to say that all Black people believe in it, but yeah, if I had been in a group of Black people, particularly people growing up acculturated into a predominantly Black environment with parents and grandparents from the South, if I had been in that kind of group of people, everybody would have been like, oh yeah, the dog's still here, right? So that was a big detour, but this is a ghost story, right? So this is about a girl named Lanisha, who, again, very similar to Bayou Magic, she lives with her grandmother in New Orleans. And this book, I could say specifically, the historical event that it references is Hurricane Katrina. So they lived through the onslaught of Hurricane Katrina, and they live in the Ninth Ward. And she sees ghosts. She can see ghosts everywhere. She sees ghosts. She speaks to them. They talk to her. Sometimes they want her to carry messages. Sometimes they're just there, right? It doesn't scare her. It's just a reality of her life. So there is a way in which her ability to see spirits enables her to survive the flooding of the Ninth Ward with Hurricane Katrina. And so, like Bayou Magic, this shows the intersection of race and climate change and poverty, and the way that communities that live in close proximity to nature, immediately dependent on nature, and not able to, through massive structures and technology, protect themselves from the onslaught of nature, are made more vulnerable to climate crisis, even climate crisis that is brought about by or exacerbated by the actions of governments and corporations and more upper class people. And so while neither of these books are didactic about the government's culpability, they do show it, right? From a child's perspective, they're able to show the intersection of environmental racism and poverty. So Lanisha and her grandmother are very poor. They do not have a car. They live in a community where not a lot of people have cars. And so a lot of people die in this community simply because they didn't have, first of all, they're more vulnerable because they are living below sea level when the levees broke, and they didn't have transportation. And another thing it shows that I don't think people really realize is that a lot of the death and the devastation actually happens after the storm. Like, they get through the night of the storm pretty good, right? But it's after the storm that the levees broke, right? And it's not only because of the breaking of the levees, but also the government's negligence. There's a point at which Lanisha actually realizes, wow, no one is coming. No one is coming. No one is coming to help me. No one is coming to help my grandmother. No one is coming. Like, I have to do it myself, right? So through a child's perspective in very simple, beautiful language and without being didactic, the book is a super powerful critique of the role of the state in perpetuating the devastation, right, that people in the Ninth Ward and that particularly Black poor people in New Orleans experienced with this storm, and how it didn't have to be, right? So I actually read this with my graduate seminar. I taught a course called The Black Aquatic, where we were thinking about Black people's complicated relationships to water. And that is one of the books that we read. Okay, next one, much more cheerful, is Amari and the Night Brothers. And I mentioned this one in my last episode where I talked about Legendborn, because there's a lot of similarities and parallels. They're both kind of about these magical girls, these Black girls with magical powers that go to a school that turns out to hold a secret society of youth that are fighting like a supernatural fight. They both experience racism, both direct and structural, about how the families of the children who are descended from these white, wealthy, powerful families have advantages going into competing for their different positions within these like magical societies. It's both very kind of Black girl in a white world, right? And I think that might be where the similarities stop. I think this was such a great book, even though, of course, there's definitely some racism and classism. And we see the relationship between race and what's going on at this like magical school type of environment, but it was not the central factor of the story. It wasn't so central, and it wasn't like she was just kind of being traumatized the whole time. But there is still a grief element in both of these books. Like in Legendborn, Brianna was grieving the loss of her mother and trying to find out what happened to her mother. We have a similar setup here where Amari is grieving the loss of her brother, who was also a member of this magical society. And she basically is going to the school to try to find out what happened. Well, she wants to go, but she also is trying to find out what happened to her brother. So we've also got some similarity there in the setup, but the books are really different. So that is yet another reminder. Just because something you want to do might seem similar to something that's already been done doesn't mean don't do it, because you could have a very, very similar plot setup and the books can also be really, really different. I think this definitely is for younger readers. So it leads into the colorfulness and like a little bit of the silliness of this kind of world. So basically, the Bureau of Supernatural Affairs, I think it is called. It's this parallel world. Basically, in this world, all of the magical beings, the elves, the werewolves, the magicians. I don't know if there are any mermaids, but I'm sure there are. But all of these magical beings are vampires. They're real. These beings are real. And most humans can't see them because they have the ability to kind of glamour themselves and make people see something different. And so you have this bureau, that's one of those words I've never been able to say, of supernatural affairs that make sure that human beings don't find out what's actually going on, and that tries to kind of contain the violence of these kind of beings existing in the world, right? So if there's a vampire attack that kills a bunch of people, the Bureau is going to come in and like wipe people's memories, come up with a cover story, all of that kind of stuff, right? Which there are similar things again going on in Legendborn. But it leans, as something for younger readers, it leans more into the silliness of it. Like when she's going through the elevators of the different floors of the school, you have a floor where everybody's invisible, so you don't see anybody, but you see people talking. You have a floor where everybody can fly, that kind of stuff. So it's much more whimsical. This is way more whimsical, more fun. It's cute. It's just a really cute book. It is going to be a series, so it is a cliffhanger at the end. There is a big twist. Amari's really funny. Amari has a personality. That's another thing. I feel like sometimes when these protagonists are being written for these fantasies where people are doing a lot of world building, they forget to build their protagonists. Give the protagonist some color, some dimension, some personality. And I definitely feel like Amari, she's funny. I definitely feel like she has a personality. She's a character you want to spend time with. So I haven't read, I think the sequel's out, so I need to go ahead and finish this up because I really enjoyed that. And I wish I had that kind of book when I was a little girl like that, because I don't remember having anything like that. The Jumbies by Tracy Baptiste. I'm not going to say too much about this because I read this a long time ago. This is one of the first books I read when I started the Mermaids Project. This book actually does not have mermaids in it, but I had to read this one because the second book in this series, Rise of the Jumbies, introduces mermaids as well as the character of Mama Delo, who I believe to be a Caribbean manifestation of Mami Wata. So you don't get Mama Delo yet in this book. This book is about a young girl. This is a common plot setup in a lot of the fantasy books I've been reading, but a young girl whose mother has died and she lives with her father, who's a fisherman. This is almost an identical setup to like several Black Mermaid books I've read, but she lives with her father, who's a fisherman on a fictional Caribbean island. And her father gets involved with this woman who turns out to be a Jumbie named Severine. And a Jumbie is kind of an expansive term in Caribbean folklore for a supernatural being. So there's lots of different kinds of Jumbies, different kinds of creatures. And so Severine doesn't have good intentions, right? And so she has to try to rescue her father from this Jumbie spirit. So it's good. It's good. It's a really good, fun book. And it introduced, for people who don't know any of these Caribbean folklores, you run into a lot of cool, different kinds of creatures and characters. So that's really good. Oh, and that's by Tracy Baptiste. And Tracy Baptiste is the same author who wrote a pretty famous op-ed about the whole Black mermaid controversy. We have always had Black mermaids, or mermaids have always been Black. So that was by Tracy Baptiste. Next one I'm going to talk about is Ophie's Ghost by Justina Ireland. And this is a historical horror fantasy, or maybe just horror. I don't really believe in categories, but I do. So I think this is something you could call fantasy, or you could call horror, you could call historical fiction. Again, this one is about ghosts. So I also think this could just be like literature, right? Like, because a lot of Black literature that isn't intended to be genre literature has ghosts in it. So again, similar to Ninth Ward, we've got a young girl who can see spirits and communicate with spirits. And there's a lot of similarities to how the spirits and the ghosts show up and the ways in which she interacts with them and the reasons for which they exist, because these ghosts also help this character, and she also can communicate with them and they can give warnings. And so it's about a girl named Ophelia who her father is killed. Lots of dead parents, relatives, every single one, except for maybe Bayou Magic. I think Bayou Magic is the only one where we don't have a parent or a sibling death. But almost every single one of these books, we have a parent death. So her father dies, I believe, because of racial violence. Yes. Her father dies because of racial violence in the South, something to do about the success of his business. It was something around that. I read this a while ago, so I don't quite remember. But this happens in the first few chapters, so I'm going to tell you that. His ghost basically saves her and her mother from being killed by the same people who killed her father. And then her and her mother move up north, where they end up living and working in like a boarding house. And so this is a boarding house, so it's just full of ghosts. So it's just a story about Ophelia and these one particular ghost and how she basically solves a murder. Yeah, so I'll stop there so I don't say too much about it to give it away. But great book, great book. I really enjoyed it. Sad. It's sad because unlike most of these books, the death of the parent happens on, I mean, it doesn't happen on page in the sense that we don't see the scene of his death, but the character experiences, knows that her father has died. And so she's very fresh in her grief. So there is a sadness to it, but it is really good. It's a really good book. I actually like couldn't put it down. The last one, oh, do I want to talk about this? Because it's complex and I also read it a long time ago. So Eden's Everdark by, oh, and I don't think I said the author for Ophie's Ghost, Justina Ireland. So Eden's Everdark by Karen Strong. Look at that cover. I have spent so much money on books lately, and so much of it is because the covers just, oh, the covers are just so beautiful lately. And like sometimes they're better than the book. Not the case for this one. This was really beautiful. It is again about a girl whose mother has died. Fantasy, man, y'all just be killing these parents. But her mother has died, and her father and her travel to, I think they're in the South Carolina or the Georgia Sea. I think they're off the course of the Georgia Sea Islands, this island that her mother grew up on. So again, it's another book that references the cultural context without being super specific. Like, it's definitely Gullah Geechee culture folklore, but I don't remember if they ever really explicitly say that. But this is kind of a horror fantasy. It's kind of scary. This is actually kind of a scary book. But they go to her mother's home island and she discovers these really scary drawings that her mother did as a young girl. And basically, she ends up in this other dream dimension, which her mother also visited as a child. And there is a witch there. And she ends up being held captive by this witch and these magical children that this witch has. Because the witch really just kind of wants to be a mom, I guess. And she just wants company. But the way she goes about it is to kidnap these kids or to hold these spirits captive. So it's kind of an afterlife world. The people who are there are people who have died. But the way that is depicted, the description of the children, the spirit children in this world have indigo skin, which then I think is kind of a call out and a reference to some of the history of the region, the South Carolina, Georgia coast sea island region where there were indigo plantations and people's skin would be stained. Their hands would be stained from the indigo plants. But they have like indigo skin and stars all over their skin. It's very visually beautiful. The descriptions is super atmospheric. Again, it's another one that's kind of sad. The atmosphere is a little heavy, but it's also just like really beautiful. Really, the world building is very original. And it is another one that draws on African derived spirituality, but also does its own thing, right? So it doesn't specifically name any spiritual system. It does its own creativity, its own magic, but there's a way in which it feels very, as a person who's been studying African diasporic religions, even though I can't say I saw a specific religion in this book, there was a feeling of familiarity to how the magic was working. So just so beautiful. This is one that is as beautiful as the cover. So read it. Okay, that's it. Of course, there's more that I've read, but those are the ones I chose to talk about this time. And I hope that you've enjoyed this and got some good book recs. You have just listened to the Merwomanist podcast with Mami Melusine. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, I would love 5 stars, and subscribe for future episodes. You can follow me on Instagram at Mami, that's MAMI, _Melusine, or at Merwomanist Podcast, on LinkedIn at Jalondra Davis, or my website, jalondradavis.com. Wishing you love and laughter and hoping to see you swim this way again.